So it was a couple weeks ago that I was reminded by the parable of the Good Samaritan. Stacy and I were on vacation, and we were traveling through the city of San Francisco, and we were taking the public transportation system. And it was around 8 or 9 o'clock at night. It was starting to get dark out, and we're standing there waiting for the bus. And as we're standing there, a man comes along. This man is shouting things, kind of randomly shouting different words and phrases, not really making a whole lot of sense. He's banging on the side of a building that he's walking next to. He's banging on a garbage can. And he's wearing a ratty t-shirt with stains on it and holes in it. His jeans look that way too, blue jeans with lots of holes in them. And he's barefoot. But it doesn't look like he was intentionally barefoot. His feet had cuts on them and bruises, and they were covered in dirt. And this man comes along to us, and Stacy and I are standing there by ourselves, travelers in a foreign land, if you will. And this man comes along and sees us, and he starts shouting some of these phrases and words at us. And I was kind of afraid because I didn't know what this man was going to do to us. I didn't know what was going on. So I did my best to look at my phone as if it was the most interesting thing on earth. And eventually this man walked past us. And then we decided to cross to the other side of the street and wait for the bus on the other side of the street. And fortunately, the bus came and picked us up, and we had no more interactions with this man. But as I think about that moment, I felt like every single character in the parable of the Good Samaritan. I felt like the victim because here we were traveling. We're afraid. We don't know what this man is going to do to us. We feel sort of accosted by this man. I felt like the robber because as this man walked by us and was trying to engage us, totally ignored him. And in that act of ignoring him, I stripped him of his human dignity by not acknowledging him as a human person. In that moment, I felt like the priest. I was afraid for my own safety, and so we crossed to the other side, quite literally. In that moment, I felt like the Levite because I looked at this man and I made a judgment about him based on what he was wearing, how he was acting. Even though he was barefoot, I made a judgment about him. And I felt like the Samaritan only afterwards, because I was able to recognize there was something missing. There was compassion missing in that interaction that I had with that man. And as I thought about the parable of the Good Samaritan, I realized that all of us are on our own journey of faith. We're at different places in our journey of faith, and this journey of faith is called life. And we too might relate to some of the different characters in the parable. Maybe we feel like a victim when our world is turned upside down by a sudden illness or even a terminal disease. Maybe we feel like a victim when a natural disaster strikes or violence happens. We too feel stripped of our human dignity and feel helpless. and we yearn for compassion. Or maybe we relate to the robbers. I think many of us don't want to relate to the robbers. But whenever there's a moment in our life when we either consciously or unconsciously ignore another person, make a judgment about another person, and strip them of their human dignity, the right to food, clothing, shelter, and the pursuit of happiness, maybe we too feel like a robber. And we also yearn for compassion, for God's compassion on us. Maybe we relate with the priest, this man who had just worked some long hours in the Jerusalem temple as a priest, and he was leaving Jerusalem and going down to Jericho, and he chose not to stop and help this victim, because if he had stopped to help, he might have been contaminated, and he would have been unable to perform his duties as a priest. Or maybe he was just tired from a day's work. But he passed by to the other side of the road. He saw and he passed by. He did not show compassion. Or maybe you feel like the Levite. The Levite was someone born into a family, along with the priest. The priest and the Levite would have been born into a certain family that followed certain rules. And they were told from an early age, and they learned from an early age, not to interact with other people who might be of a different religion, other people who might be of a different race or ethnicity. They were told not to interact with other people who might be of a different economic status than their own, either too rich or maybe other people who are too poor. They're told to keep their distance. And they're also told to keep aware of the dangers before them, like the danger of stopping to help this man. What's to say that those robbers aren't waiting for him as well? If the Levite were to stop, the robbers might be there as well. Those moments when we judge other people based on their actions, their clothing, their race, their religion, their economic status, maybe we too relate to the Levite. I think all of us, just like the lawyer in the story, would like to justify ourselves and relate most closely to the Samaritan. The Samaritan, a foreign person who showed compassion. What's so special about this parable is that it's not a parable about doing the right thing. At the heart of this parable, at the center of this parable, is compassion. Actually, quite literally. If you look at the Greek words, there are 68 words before the word compassion, and there are 67 words after the word compassion. Compassion is literally at the heart of this parable. And so as we think about this foreign person who came along and saw someone in need, saw a mess, and stopped to demonstrate and show compassion, we can think not only about the parable of the Good Samaritan, but we can also think about the cross. As our God stopped to look at each and every one of us in our human mess, whenever we feel like a victim, whenever we feel like a priest, whenever we feel like a Levite, whenever we feel like a robber, our God stopped and has compassion on each and every one of us, so that we too might have compassion on others. It's a pretty powerful story because it demonstrates and it shows us how to demonstrate compassion. Now, in this congregation, there's a lot of Good Samaritan stories that transpire. I know of one that happened this past week that's not really mine to tell. But I can think of a number of others that happen in the midst of our congregation. One of them you'll get to experience right after the worship service today as we hear about the Appalachia Service Project, where our mission trip people went out to Appalachia to demonstrate compassion and receive compassion from the people they worked with. Another opportunity is all the interaction we've been having with the abundance of refugee families. As they come into Sheboygan and we have the opportunity to interact with them, they show us compassion as we show them compassion. I think about the community meal happening this afternoon or the Emmaus meal happening next weekend. A meal of compassion. We all like to justify ourselves like the lawyer and say that we're the Good Samaritan. But in the end, that compassion is something that comes only from God working in and through us. As we reflect on our own journey of faith called life, whether we relate to the victim, the robber, the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan, I hope and pray that wherever we are at on our journey, we may know God's compassion. Amen.